Ready to go? All right. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Dave Conley, and I'm very pleased to be here. I had an opportunity to speak with a group like this in Hawaii in August. I'm just curious, is anyone at that session? Just, wow. Thank you so much for returning for a second time. You'll hear a couple things that are a little bit different, I think, this time. My intent is, as mentioned, is to give you kind of the overview, the big picture, and to kind of set the stage, and then we'll let our practitioners fill in the details and really go a lot deeper on these issues. And what I'm going to focus on is really what does it take for students to be ready for college and careers. I want to start by kind of going over some of the issues right now about where the system falls a little bit short, but more importantly, how our world has changed. And even though you know some of these things, I want to reiterate them for you. I want to give you a model that talks about a way to think about college and career readiness that's more complex than what we have historically done. And then I want to show you some ways in which we can measure college and career readiness, and finally end with a few recommendations about policy, and maybe set the stage for our following speakers then to give you a lot of more examples as well. So as I go through here, I'm trying to move fairly quickly. I know when I'm done, we will have time for question and answer, and from my experience in Honolulu, I know this is generally a lively group as far as that goes, and I would certainly encourage any questions that you have once we get through this piece. So if you want to go ahead and plug in the clicker, that'd be great. Thank you. A lot of what I will present comes out of a couple of books that I've written on this topic, and in addition to other writings. If you're interested in any of this, you can go a little deeper taking a look at those books. I also should mention that we're going to put the presentation, make it available on your organization's website. We'll also make it available on our organization's website as well. And that address will be on the very last slide. And it's a place, if you want to get some more information about the work that we're doing, that would be a place that you can take a look. The organization is the Educational Policy Improvement Center, known modestly as EPIC. And the address, as I said, is on the last slide, but it's epiconline.org. Well, I probably don't need to tell you that today's students are entering a different world than many of us entered. But it's worth acknowledging, and it's worth thinking about a little bit, because our education system is based on some assumptions about the world that students are going to enter, and those assumptions aren't true anymore, anywhere near to the same degree they were 40, 50 years ago, 30 years, in some cases even 20 years ago. We've had a model that has said, certainly for the last two generations, that the goal should be to work for a large company, get one job for life, see your pay increase steadily, stay in your hometown, have a secure retirement, not really worry, even if you're not that highly educated, that you'd still have a career, and that you wouldn't really be competing too much for your job with anyone internationally. Now, I come from Oregon. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon, and the economy of Oregon and Washington are both similar in some regards, that historically they had a very strong emphasis on resource extraction. And in Oregon, that meant timber. And the timber industry in that state has slowed dramatically, will never come back to the point it was. We have whole towns and communities that have just simply contracted because those jobs are no longer there. But beyond that, the second generation of jobs that came into Oregon were in areas, for example, high-end recreational vehicles in Lane County, where I live. We were one of the two places in the country, Elkhart, Indiana was the other one, that was so specialized in these high-end luxury RVs. You probably see them, the ones that they're rolling down the road, the buses with all the, the designs on them and everything, the really high-end vehicles. Well, as you probably can surmise, the market for those died in the by 2007, 2008, 2009, just completely died. We saw employment in that industry sector in Lane County go from about 5,000 people down to less than 1,000 people. We lost 4,000 jobs in the period of a couple of years. What kind of jobs did we lose? We lost jobs where they were well-paying jobs, but they didn't require a lot of formal training and education. It might involve being a cabinet installer for these luxury RVs, or a driver, or some other occupation that didn't require that you'd have a certificate or a degree to do them. Now, when those jobs were lost, what did we hear? Euphemistically, we'd hear in the newspaper, well, those people are going to need retraining. But have you ever really thought about what the word retraining means? Retraining means, in almost every case, education. It means that we're going to have to provide people with some form of formal learning for them to acquire new skills. Well, what are some of the jobs that you find in Lane County that are still prevalent and that are still increasing? Well, call centers are one of them. We have Carnival Cruise, we've got Enterprise Car Rental, and a number of others for various reasons, including the fact that a lot of people have been laid off in Lane County over the last 10 to 15 years, and so there's a labor force. But what does it take to move from being a cabinet installer to being a client support representative? Well, client support representatives have a completely different skill set, don't they? They have to know the technology, they have to be able to do technical manuals, they have to be able to change repeatedly as new offers come along and new price structures come along. They need to understand the goals of their company. They need to do much more than just a job. They have to get along with people. So retraining here is really not going to work unless the people who are being retrained have very solid educational foundations. They've done well enough in school to be lifelong learners. That's what we mean, that's what we need when we talk about a lifelong learner, someone who could be retrained and go in a completely different direction. Because today's world, what we're finding is smaller companies, 500 employees or fewer, are the job generators right now. And for the foreseeable future, look like they'll be very important job generators, not the 10,000 employee companies. They're still laying off. We're seeing that individuals are changing jobs regularly, that it's become a part of the economy, that you have to change jobs and in some cases change careers. My 23-year-old daughter, who graduated from college 2.5 years ago, has changed careers twice, not jobs, careers. So it's a different world as far as the expectations. We know that the expectation that you'll get more money simply for showing up and gaining seniority is probably not going to be as prevalent at all. You're going to have to earn that money by increasing your value to the company or the organization. If you're working in a small organization, your value becomes that much more pronounced because there's fewer people in it. How do you have young people who get this message, that this is the world, that they'll be competing with others for their jobs, and that they'll be subject to competition internationally? You know, the paradox is that many of our young people grew up in relatively privileged environments in the sense of the belief that they're entitled to something. I don't mean that they're always rich, but a psychology that they're entitled to a good living, at least as good as their parents. If you ask a lot of these young people, a lot of them are males, unfortunately, they believe that they're entitled to a job as a video game tester, getting paid $80,000 and being given a company Maserati to drive. I mean, they've got completely unrealistic expectations for what they can accomplish in the world based on the skills that they have. And a lot of these young people are subject to a whole series of issues and problems because of the economy that they're going to be entering and the educational initiative that they take and skills that they develop. Our economy's out of step with the rest of the world because it's growing faster but creating fewer jobs. U.S. workers have become so productive that it's harder for anyone without a job to get one. And our companies are profiting, but they're not hiring, not fast enough to replace the 7.5 million jobs. If you think about that number, that's more than all the people in the state of Washington and Oregon combined, 7.1 million jobs lost. So what is this world going to look like? Certainly for the foreseeable future, you're going to have to be adaptive and flexible as a learner. You're going to have high skills, make high contribution. You have to be ready to work for a smaller company, change jobs, move around, be adaptive, keep adding skills as you go on. Think about what kind of a learner that is, and then think about how we're measuring learner success today. About 1 in 3 students who enroll in either a 4-year or 2-year college will transfer at some point. 65 to 85% of students will change their majors. Young adults will change jobs an average of 7 times from age 20 to 29. And those are not career changes we're talking about. We're talking about people who don't know what they're doing for the most part. Now, the idea that you can change majors and change colleges is kind of a time-honored tradition in the U.S. But increasingly what we're seeing is this means people don't continue effectively on a career pathway. It affects lifetime income and career development. But more importantly, in many cases, they're just not getting through. If we look at college completion rates at 4-year institutions, at public institutions, the best we're doing is around 50%. If we look at 2-year institutions, the completion rates to getting a degree are in the 30% range and below, so or a certificate. Our students aren't completing. They're not focused. They don't know what they want to do, and they take more time. We're one of the only countries in the world that allows this second chance, that allows this kind of openness and flexibility, and it's a good thing, but it can't go on indefinitely. We need to have students be making better choices and decisions, getting a general idea of the skills they need to progress in different areas. The problem with remedial education, it's twofold. One is we have way too many people in remedial education. In some community colleges, it's 80% plus of the students coming in mathematics. And the second problem is if you go into community college at a remedial level, you don't come out of it. Most students don't recover from being at a remedial level. So we need higher skill levels. We need more focus. We need more clarity going into college so that you can develop a set of learning skills that not only enable you to get the content knowledge, but enable you to be a flexible, adaptive, lifelong learner. And if you had any doubt about this at all, the last few weeks have just highlighted the fact that we are entering a policy environment that's focused on college and career readiness, not on basic skill acquisition. And it's not enough to be able to read and write. It will be the expectation that our young people will be judged, and our system, our education system will be judged on the proportion of students who go on to education beyond high school. And certainly the ESEA reauthorization and the NCLB waivers are examples of that, but many states are taking specific actions, and I know some of the states in this room have programs that are very clearly focused on dramatically increasing the proportion of students who go on to post-secondary education. Oregon's one of those states, yes.
So would you say, tell me if I understand, or getting there?
That, you're correct. Currently, the best measures we have are simply status counts. We're counting how many people have achieved a certain status. We're not really aware of how ready people are, and as a result, when we use a metric that does nothing but count how many people made it enrolled, for example, the colleges have no incentive to keep them and have them succeed. So the college will enroll a lot of people, and there's no particular consequence if the students were qualified or not going in. And I'm going to give you some examples of how you can deal with that going along here. So the definition that we need to think about beyond just getting a high school diploma is success without remediation in credit-bearing general ed courses or two-year certificate programs. And this is a fairly open-ended definition if you think about it, because the skill range I'm describing is wide. It goes all the way from someone who can become an LPN to somebody who can, or licensed practical nurse, or somebody who can get a bachelor's degree. But nevertheless, it's a definition that includes our young people, but also sets not just a floor, but also a very, very high ceiling for what we expect for readiness. So let me talk about readiness just a little bit more. And let me introduce 4 levels of readiness for you to think about. One level is work readiness, and that's a level that people need basically to be employable. And I just read a story today about Alabama trying to find replacement workers because many of the workers are no longer showing up to work in the fields and agriculture, and they look for replacement workers. And one of the problems has been that the replacement workers they show up late, they work for a day or half a day and then leave and never come back. Or they can't do the job well, or they don't work very hard, or it's too hot, or whatever it is. Work ready is that ability to meet employers' minimal expectations. And you probably have seen multiple surveys of employer expectations. The minimal expectations are depressingly low, aren't they? They want people who can show up on time, not be on drugs, not be drinking, and not get in fights with other people. Those are the minimal expectations, and employers will tell you that for entry-level jobs, 40–50% of their applicants don't meet that level. So work readiness is our first level where we want young people to be. That's not something school teaches per se, but being in school should help you to get some of that. Job ready is the second level. That's the training that the employer gives for a specific job. That training can be very simple or very complex, but it's something that the schools cannot do. So we need to acknowledge that schools don't train students for all the jobs that are out there. They're different. They're far too complex, and the economy changes too fast. We can, however, make sure that the students can follow directions, can think and analyze and solve problems, and have other skills that they need to be able to learn the basics for any job. We also want them certainly to be able to read, write, and follow and understand basic mathematical principles as well. But these two are levels where we want everyone, but this should not be enough for our schooling. formal schooling needs at the least to get students to the level of career ready, which is sufficient foundational knowledge to be able, and general learning strategies, to be able to pursue education in a career pathway. Now that could be at a 2-year institution, it could be at a 4-year institution. But it's a level that says I can not just get a job, I can pursue a career. My middle daughter is a paramedic in Portland, but she graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in human physiology, then went to a 2-year program and got her training. She is now applying to a nursing program. Now, clearly, she's an exception in some senses, but it illustrates the point that the level of training you need in our society now is sufficient to pursue a career pathway, not just get a job. Because if you just have a job, too much can change. If all you can do is operate one medical device, and tomorrow that medical device gets outsourced to India, which happens nowadays, a lot of the diagnosing gets sent offshored, and your device isn't needed or it becomes automated, and you can't move in your professional area, then you're in just as bad a shape as the person who doesn't have the education you have. The final level, college ready, is characterized by 4 keys that I'm going to share with you in a moment that apply also to career readiness. But I want to say that our research of analyzing entry-level college courses has discerned that these are much more important in the context of the general education courses you need to pursue a bachelor's degree. And in the U.S., we're very different from the rest of the world. Our higher ed system starts everybody off with general education if you're going for a 4-year degree. You take some math, you take some science, you take some humanities, you take some art, music. You take a variety of courses, and then you move to your major. This is simply not the model in most of the rest of the world. So our young people need to be fairly broadly educated. What we do in general education in our colleges and universities is done in the 13th year of schooling in many other countries. That's their general education year. It's also their year of many tests and exams that we don't have in our country because our final year of high school is paradoxically the least challenging year for many students who have compiled the credit requirements they need to move on and can then coast a little bit during that senior year. These are the 4 keys, and I'm going to explain each of them relatively quickly, but just to give you an idea of them. Key cognitive strategies, and if you notice, we put it above the content knowledge, and the message I give to you is that you can't have one without the other. You can't think unless you're thinking about something. So having students formulate problems, do research, interpret findings and results, communicate in writing and otherwise, and then do all that with precision and accuracy are things that have to happen in the context of challenging content knowledge. And what we're learning increasingly is that if students don't have these key learning skills and techniques, they're never going to get beyond a certain point with their content knowledge. I just wonder how often the educators sit back and, after struggling for years to increase test scores, I just wonder if you really ask educators what's their explanation of why test scores have not skyrocketed to the very top of the scale, what it would be. Well, part of it is we don't teach students how to be learners. They pick that up incidentally. And most of us in this room have picked up a lot of strategies for being effective learners that many young people don't get, and so they don't retain that content knowledge we're teaching them. And then finally, the last thing is key transition knowledge and skills. Going from high school to anything after high school, whether it's the military or whether it's a career program or training, even an apprenticeship, whether it's a 2-year certificate or whether it's a baccalaureate's degree, is a transition. It's a key life transition, and there's an incredible amount of knowledge that's involved in that in this country, but there's also other dimensions as well of making that transition, and we don't attend to that very systematically. Therefore, our least prepared students, and I mean that not just in knowledge, but culturally, the ones who have the least amount of insight into all of the hidden messages and all of the hidden agendas it takes to transition successfully, they're the ones who are least likely to go on from high school to college. So let's quickly go through these. What's a cognitive strategy? It's a systematic approach to achieve key learning goals that uses methods and ways of thinking of the academic disciplines. Every academic discipline has a way of thinking, doesn't it? English, you think about things in one fashion. You might think about literary critique and literary analysis and the structure of writing. In mathematics, you might think about logic and the use of logic and deduction and analytic methods. In science, you might use the scientific method and use inductive methods and think about problem solving through different lenses. Each subject area has a different way of thinking about knowledge and of processing information. So cognitive strategies are things that help you to get deeper in your understanding of the content knowledge. So our model talks about problem formulation, and we've identified this as things that, this is what you need largely in 2- and 4-year college courses. You need to be able to do these kinds of things to do well in those courses. And what's really challenging here is that problem formulation is not the same as problem solving. When we give people the problem, we have taken away one of the key aspects of what occurs in the real world, which is setting the problem up determines the nature of the problem and the nature of the solution set. So problem formulation is where we start. What's your hypothesis and what's your strategy? What do you think about the problem? Okay, once you've done that, you need some information. We call this research, but it could also be data collection. It could be analytic methods of collecting information from a variety of sources. You could have primary source information. You could have secondary source information. You could have literature reviews, articles, many ways you can come up with information. But you have to identify it and collect it. Our young people have a tremendous challenge because we have confused typing with your thumbs with technological literacy, and they're not the same thing. And so our young people don't really know how to get information and prioritize it and use it. I was just reading a student's piece of work yesterday. It was a literary analysis, and she actually had done a good, she'd gotten a source. It was Jane Eyre, and she'd gotten someone else's critique of Jane Eyre through using feminist theory. Someone else had critiqued Jane Eyre, and she'd gotten that. But you could tell that she had no idea whether that was a acceptable critique or not. I mean, she didn't have enough frame of reference to know if her source was valid or off target or whatever. Now, that's the problem with access to all this information. Students can come up with source information, but they don't know anything about whether it's useful or valuable or appropriate. The next step, then, once you formulated your problem, you got some information, then you need to interpret what you have before you start writing. And our young people do not like this step for the most part. They want to be given the problem, and then they want to go right down here and start writing it up. Analysis is when you think about the information you have. And very often, when you're doing your analysis phase, you can realize you don't have the information you need to solve the problem, in which case you have to go back and get some more information. That requires persistence, doesn't it? That's a whole different character trait. And if we have trained our young people to be nothing but procedural learners where they're following directions and oriented only towards an outcome and an output, then they won't want to do things that involve more time and more cognitive processes. But let's say you formulated your problem, done your research and got your data, interpreted what you have, you're actually set up pretty well now to communicate it. And when you write it up, you need to organize it in ways that are consistent with that subject area, and it may be presented orally or it may be in writing. If it's a problem, it has to follow certain conventions about how you report it. And then you have to construct your response. Even at this point, you can decide you need some additional information or clarification. And you have to do all this with precision and accuracy. And one of the things about access to computers is that young people have very often decided that a spell checker is the sole source of precision and accuracy, which leads to some periodically humorous results, and generally speaking, a lack of attention to detail, particularly when students are working fast. I was an assistant principal. I spent 20 years of my career in public education before I went into higher ed. And I had a master's degree. I had an administrator's license. And I was an assistant principal at a pretty good-sized high school, which qualified me to stand out in the hallways and guard the trash cans between classes, which I did very great efficiency. But one day I noticed these two kids walking by. One had a backpack, and the other had a piece of paper on the backpack, was writing on the piece of paper on the backpack, on his friend's backpack, while the two of them were walking in the hallway. I could not figure out what this was about, so it intrigued me. So I followed them. They walked along until all of a sudden they made a right turn and turned into a classroom, literally 2 seconds before the bell rang. I mean, they had this thing timed down to the second. And I watched them, in the classroom, and I watched as he stopped writing, that his buddy went off and sat down. He walked up to the desk, handed his assignment in, and then went and sat down. Now, that's just-in-time learning on the one hand, but on the other hand, what's the attention to quality, to detail, to precision, and accuracy that's going into that you can basically be scribbling something while you walk down the hall, turn it in, and have it count? That's the environment our young people live in, and unfortunately, it doesn't get you to this level of precision and accuracy that you need when you leave school. That lifelong learner, lifetime learner, the adaptive, flexible learner understanding these things. So, just move through these quickly. The other thing we have to think about with our learners is moving them from novice to expert. And they'll never reach expert while they're in school, but they certainly can become accomplished. They can become accomplished novices, if nothing else. But what's the difference between a novice and an expert? In short, well, I'll get to that in one second. Our schools treat all learners as novices, even when whether they're in the 6th grade or the 12th grade. We still treat them as novices. We keep introducing new information, and then in ways that assume they don't know how to learn it any better than they did in 6th grade. And therefore, all learning becomes procedural. All knowledge is declarative knowledge, and declarative knowledge is basically kind of factual. Procedural learning is largely following directions. And our learners don't progress and deepen their expertise as learners. When they get to college, they don't understand how the experts in the subject area think about problems. They don't understand what it means to be an independent learner. The college instructors are, perennially frustrated with the incoming students because those students, basically, as the college instructors would say, they don't know how to think for themselves. That would be the simplistic way that a college instructor would describe it. But what we're seeing is a lack of progression from novice toward expert in the way that they think about being a learner, not just in the subject area itself, but as a learner. And now you're probably familiar with this, but novices tend to focus on discrete knowledge in isolation, whereas experts are going to be looking far more at patterns. They're going to look at content. They're going to use prior content. They're going to learn through example and analogy. They're going to use mental cues. They're going to integrate the pieces of knowledge into systems frameworks. So basically, experts are more efficient because they can chunk information up. Experts can deal with lack of information. If they can see a pattern, they can fill in the empty spaces in that pattern. And as adults, most of us have become expert learners and problem solvers out of necessity, and we have multiple strategies available to us for solving problems. So I'll ask you to reflect here for one moment. Has anyone here ever bought anything at IKEA or any of those places where, what's the general characteristic of anything you buy there? Well, you got to put it together, right? So think for just a minute about the strategies you use when you're confronted with a complex something that you bought. Could someone give me a strategy that you would use in a situation like that when you've got the thing home now and you're trying to figure out what to do next? All right, invite your son-in-law over. What was that? Fix a drink, sit down and, think. Oh, wow, we've got someone who reads the directions. Okay.
Don't do that.
What is that?
If you're male, you do not get the directions out.
No, the men don't get, that's true. That's why I'm always surprised when someone reads the directions. Good. Yeah, and that's kind of pattern matching. So the reading the directions is getting tougher and tougher because the directions are having fewer and fewer words in them, by the way, which is interesting. Any other strategies that you use?
Look at the picture.
Okay, visual learner. So you've got different forms of that. The thing about, anyone here do trial and error? You just put stuff together, and when it gets done, you look, and there's a few pieces left, and you're really hoping they're not important. I mean, I'll admit to doing that. Now, there's other ways. There's 800 lines and websites. There's people who make a living standing around these stores offering to put the stuff together for you. So lots of ways you can cope with the problem. Because for you, your self-image isn't tied up in this. What you want to do is get the thing assembled and do the most efficient way possible. Have you ever stood by and watched someone else attempt to assemble one of these things, and you could see they were using an inefficient or ineffective strategy, and you were expected to keep your mouth shut? Anyone ever been in that situation? Okay. You don't really want to be pointing out to them what they're doing wrong. What happens when someone uses an ineffective strategy and refuses to reflect on the problem that's happening. What starts to happen? Certain amount of frustration, or maybe they start banging on it. I mean, there's like any variety of bad outcomes that occur. But basically, pursuing a strategy that's not effective, even after you know it's not effective, it creates frustration and other results. Now, think about our young people. If they don't have any learning strategies, they are left to solve problems by following directions. What happens if by following the directions it doesn't solve the problem? Well, they're left in the same situation as that individual who had one strategy for assembling the product and couldn't do it. It becomes frustrating. They give up. They blame the teacher. They blame the problem. They blame everyone but themselves. Our learners aren't developing a full set of skills and strategies and techniques that enable them to be effective with complex problems. Well, what about key content knowledge? And you notice there's a difference between content knowledge and key content knowledge. We've developed kind of an arms race with standards of trying to add more and more things into standards, educational standards, that higher standards are those with more and more in them. And you're all aware of the Common Core standards. We'll mention those. And one of the goals of them, hopefully, is to have more larger ideas, linking ideas and organizing concepts, that students don't get the forest for the trees. For the students, it's show up every day and see a tree. And it may or may not ever aggregate up to something that is a whole. And we've analyzed a lot of textbooks. And I can tell you one thing for sure. The organization of textbooks is fundamentally arbitrary and largely sequential rather than being conceptual in nature. It does not give students any insight into the structure of knowledge in a subject area. It only shows you the sequence by which you're going to have to engage in one darn thing after another. So, once again, the learners who persist are the ones who can handle that type of decontextualized learning and can somehow make sense out of what is really quite a fire hose full of information coming at them. And you know, the human mind tosses away most of the information, the visual and sensory information that comes to it, and keeps only that which it decides is important. So this just sort of makes that same point. If we wonder why test scores don't go up, it's because most of what's taught gets forgotten. It's not complicated. It's not taught in a way that's memorable. It's not taught in a way that is organized in any way. It's not taught in a way where the brain puts any priority on it. And the behavior is procedural and almost ritualistic relative to learning. So why should it be a surprise that, particularly at the high school level, test scores have been flat? Pretty much the first 2 or 3 years after you introduce a test, they'll go up, and there's a familiarization phenomenon, and then they'll level off. And then they'll bump around in a range. And so 1 year, yours will bump up, and you'll be at an exemplary school, and then 2 years later, you're down and needs improvement. They bump. It's because we don't. First of all, it's what we're measuring. Second of all, it's how we're measuring it, and third of all, it's how we're teaching it and how these things fit together. Well, hopefully the Common Core standards help us to identify what students should know and do in relation to best practices. Hopefully they'll let us get a greater cognitive challenge and be more focused and be a framework for detailed development of curriculum. I say hopefully because the jury's still out. But if they're successful, what we'll have is some agreement about what's important, and we can frame that around some larger organizers than just lists of content. Now, there's certainly not a catalog of all the knowledge students will need to succeed in every college course or career pathway. And we just have to be honest about this. We're never going to teach everyone everything they need to know. So what's a reasonable amount? And how can we do that in a way that as a result of learning it, you also know what you don't know. And you know that you're going to have to keep learning throughout your life. That's a different model than somehow saying, how do we make sure they know everything that they should know, and then they have no responsibility somehow to learn anything else. Third area is key learning skills and techniques. These are neglected and I think really important. Increasingly, I'm convinced that this makes the difference, particularly for students from underrepresented groups. And we're beginning to assemble evidence to this. I think that illustrates the importance of this. Some students know how to do these things. Some students are taught how to do this. But most students aren't, and they don't know how to do it. So their learning is terribly inefficient, and it never gets very efficient. And if you look at why students have trouble not only in high school but in college, it's these sorts of things. You know, the first assignment in your college course may not be due until the 9th week. Now, if you assume you got the first 8 weeks off, you have a problem. And that's not good time management. Study skills increasingly means studying with other people. But it also means knowing how to study. This came up the other day. I was talking to someone, and they were putting a study group together, and one of the people showed up with flashcards. And it was a subject that was totally inappropriate for flashcards. But you know what? That was the only technique they had for studying. So they were bringing flashcards to the study session. We believe goal setting is extremely important, particularly with low-income, first-generation college attendees, or students who would be first in family to attend college. They come from communities where goal setting is not necessarily part of the culture, where cause and effect relationships are not necessarily deeply ingrained as they are in middle-class communities. They don't know how to set a goal for themselves that's attainable. So what they'll do is set some massive goal off in the distance, and then when they can't get to it, they just give up entirely. We want students to set short-term goals, things I'm going to do differently in this class period, on the next test, on the unit test, in this class, next semester. We want them to set goals that are attainable and that give them feedback on what they did right and what they did wrong in attaining the goal. And we want them then to build this capacity to create larger and larger goals. Self-awareness is just how well are you really performing, not, because we're in a time when everybody gets an A, where every soccer team gets a trophy, where you don't really know what your performance means. High school GPAs have gone up every year for the last 30-plus years, and they're approaching a point of convergence at a 4.0, and in many states now they're above 4.0. We have weighted GPAs. Students really don't know what their performance means. Well, a lot of evidence that persistence is one of the most important characteristics, not giving up, keeping trying. And yet most of what the educational activities don't require persistence. They're done quickly. They're done one period, then on to the next thing. Worksheets would be the worst example of that, but there are others where students, there's a fear of frustrating students with challenging, intellectually engaging activities. Collaborative learning, student ownership of learning just cannot be understated. When you get to college, you will have to own your learning or you will not survive. And yet in high school, you can be fully scaffolded with the adults taking all the responsibility for everything, including writing your assignments down for you. And then 3 months later, you're expected to be a self-directed owner of learning. Yes?
The last one's student-oriented.
I think around majors, you're right. There's requirements for the majors. So ownership of learning means when you go into class, you're not expecting the adults to do everything for you. You're not expecting your college professor. Well, let me give you one example. So my son-in-law teaches freshman psychology at University of Portland. So he gets students right out of high school. Their expectation is that everything on the test will have been, that he will have given them everything that's on the test in a PowerPoint. And they will come to him and complain after the test that there was something on the test that wasn't in the PowerPoint. Okay, ownership of learning means that you're going to take the initiative to understand that to do well on the test means you have to really learn the material, not just review the PowerPoint. That's really what I mean by ownership of learning. So we have two ways we can think about this. One is we can think of intelligence as being static in nature, and in other words, this is what's called an aptitude-based attribution. I explain my performance based on my innate ability. And what that leads me to do is to say, if I don't get it the first time, then I'm not good at it, I'm not going to do it. And I think for physical activities, a lot of us, we've done that. We've decided what we're good at doing physically and what we're not good at doing physically. But for a lot of intellectual activity, you can't get good at it unless you try. Now, it's easier for some and harder for others. But nevertheless, if you have the static view, if you have the aptitude-based view, then you cannot improve. And by the way, most of our testing is built on a 1920s model that is aptitude-based at its core. It assumes that ability is a fixed construct that it distributes normally in a population, and that all of our measurements should be able to capture that normal distribution. I saw a study from England 2 days ago, I believe, in which they were able to manipulate IQ scores on teenagers, that over 2 and 3 year periods, they saw dramatic changes in IQ scores of teenagers up and down. And that shouldn't surprise some of us, particularly the down part. But intelligence is simply not, even with these aptitude-based measures, intelligence is not anywhere near as fixed as we have thought. The second option is to think of intelligence as being effort-based. The more you do something, the more result you get. And this is where brain and cognitive sciences come into play, and where all of our scans of the brain indicate that you can, in fact, build connections at any age. You can become smarter, in essence, is what it means. And that means you can be a better learner. But, you know, that's a cultural difference. Researchers asked parents in Minnesota what the explanation of their child's success was, and then they asked parents in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea what their explanation was for their child's success. Dramatically different explanations. The Minnesota parents, it was about aptitude. My kid's good at math. My kid's a good writer. The Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese parents, my child tried hard. Fundamentally different explanations for why we succeeded. And in this environment, in this world, if we want all students to get to high levels, we're going to have effort-based models. Because if we're going to believe in normal distributions and teach to normal distributions, then that's what we're going to get. And certainly, the population in the U.S. is far more educated than it was 100 years ago. So clearly, if we used our distribution from 100 years ago, we never should have gotten to this level of literacy and performance, because the theory would have said you could only get a certain percentage of the population to this level. But in the course of 100 years, by changing the environment, by changing the attitudes, by changing just the overall experience, we're at higher levels. To go higher still, it's going to take effort, and a sense that students really believe they can do it. We survey students in schools, and we can correlate the performance in that school with the explanation students give on whether or not their performance is based on aptitude or effort. Finally, the last piece is making the transition from high school to post-high school. And that has a number of components. And in the U.S., we've made it about as complicated as you can make it to go from high school to college. Some countries around the world, you take one test, you fill out one form, you're done. You know, that's it. Here, multiple forms, multiple tests, multiple deadlines. And my colleagues here from the public schools probably have had the experience of chasing kids down the hallway to get them to sign forms or fill out things or go and complete something. And what happens is every time you create a new form or a new requirement, you lose somebody. You lose kids. So what's going to happen to increase post-secondary enrollment in the U.S., the projections right now show the white student population increasing by about 1% in terms of who goes on to college. The increases are going to come from these groups of students, at least as far as our projections go. And if we actively develop policy, then these could even increase more. But if this is where the increases are going to be, what is that going to mean for schooling? These have been the populations that have been the hardest to educate so far. What is going to have to change? And what is going to have to change for this group to have more success? I just noted the other day that student debt exceeded credit card debt in the aggregate. We owe more money in this country to student loans than we owe to credit card debt. So students are going to expect and need to be able to succeed if they're going to pay the kind of money they're paying to go to college. We need a different model than the one when I went to college, which was I could kind of go, and if it worked out, fine. If it didn't, there was any number of different jobs that theoretically I could get. Now it's got to have a positive result. Think about your first-generation college attendees. They don't have the access to that transition knowledge I talked about. They don't talk about this in their home. They're not setting goals for themselves. They don't have the study skills. They don't necessarily have the support all the time to keep persisting. They may have that aptitude-based explanation, well, I'm just not smart enough. How do we get those students to move on to college in greater and greater numbers? We're going to have to change the model and change the measures and indicators we use in schooling. So our model, we boil it down to 4 things. How do you think? What do you know? How do you act? How do you go? So our cognitive strategies, our content knowledge, our key learning skills, our key transition skills. Think, know, act, go. And if we can get all of our students to think and know and act and go, we'll see the college going rates increase. We'll see success increase as well. So now what? I'm going to go over this. The accountability design principles to address college and career readiness has a lot in it, and I'm going to go fairly quickly through it. In my estimation, accountability measures need to focus on success after high school, not awarding diplomas. Now, what I mean by that is, how successful are students in making the transition from high school to post-high school? And I'll come back and talk about that more. Right now, we tend to really value graduation rates, and quite frankly, a high school diploma in and of itself is not sufficient for much of anything. So we have to be thinking about what happens as a result of the high school education, not just what diplomas got awarded. Another thing I'd caution you about is that college readiness is not a cut score. Increasingly, you'll hear testing companies coming up with formulas that say, well, this is a 50% probability that a student will get a B in an entry-level college course in this subject area, or there's variations on that. And I've seen studies that show that that's simply not true across a wide range of institutions. It may be true in one type of institution, but it's not true across the range of institutions. A cut score is convenient as a policy measure because you get a number real fast and you say 42% of our students are college ready. It's not a good tool for actually getting kids ready for college. And it's not a good tool for creating incentives for your system either. So think about the fact that we need more information about the knowledge and skills you need to be college and career ready. Education is one of the only areas where we're using the same information now to make major decisions that we did 40 years ago. You know, if you went into your doctor for a physical, or if you were ailing, and the doctor took your blood pressure and temperature and that was the only data that was collected, you'd be concerned. In schooling, we're still using grade point average, SAT, largely ACT scores for a lot of determinations, including placement into remedial education courses. We're not building broader profiles that get the kind of knowledge and skill information that these 4 keys would yield. You can also think of college and career readiness as a continuum, starting with rigorous high school courses, honors courses, dual enrollment courses that are taught at the high school, dual enrollment taught at the college, advanced placement, or IB, International Baccalaureate, and then early enrollment into college. Ideally, we should see students across a whole range of these options. We should see students moving to college more when they're ready, or being scaffolded through dual enrollment if they need that help. And we should be emptying our high schools out by the end of the senior year, not having them, and yes, they can all come back for graduation, that's fine with me, but we should be seeing them transition out as they're ready, rather than being held en masse as a group then and moved out together. I've got a number of slides that show ways to measure college readiness, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. If you want the presentation and want to take a look at that, that would be fine. But I'll just point out, these are the traditional ones, college admissions tests and high school grade point average, and here's the pros and cons of them. Graduation rates, AP and IB scores, cut scores on admissions tests, I mentioned that earlier as a policy tool. Postsecondary applications, so how many students applied to college. Students enrolled in college immediately after graduation is also a measure that can be used. Placement tests and how students perform in that. College remediation rates then. State assessments of the type that we give in high school. Student self-reports, actually, we're getting a lot of information out of that, more than one would think. For accountability purposes, actually kind of useful. Embedded performance tasks, how well can they read? How well can they do a research project that requires them to think over multiple days? How well can they deal with a mathematics problem that requires them to use a database and analyze the information from the database and have multiple potentially correct responses to that? Proficiency-based grading, this is something that's occurring in Oregon and elsewhere in the nation, where grades are a function of having met certain criteria, not just of completing certain tasks. College career readiness assessments that are specific to that, and college and career readiness assignments that are specifically designed to gauge college and career readiness more broadly. And then opportunity to learn measures of what's in a syllabus and how well are the syllabi written, and do they give students the opportunity to learn a college readiness curriculum. So Policy implications. Accountability systems need to be focused on successful transitions beyond high school, not graduation rates. More measures than content tests in math and English are necessary to gauge true readiness. And teachers, if we're going to create these evaluation systems, we should have something that gets at their ability to develop key learning skills in students, not just transmit content knowledge. So with that this is where the information is. If you'd like to take a look, we're doing a lot in these areas. We have a lot of tools ourselves that we've developed, and we're working with a lot of schools, including some of the folks in this room. We've worked with the Envision folks and with the Sammamish folks on a number of different projects. So with that, I'll stop, see if you have any questions.